Okay, so I'm trying something new here. I'm trying to shoot in the night. I've got these lamps all around me, and you can see shadows here. So maybe this is a bad video screen, but for now the focus is still Think Right, the book. So today I'm going to focus on methodology. It's one topic that I've been avoiding because it is actually one of the hardest topics that an MTH student has to face, and I think even a PhD student. But I've really struggled because, especially in this book, this is where, if you saw the previous video, this is where I was criticized that it's too complicated, it's too hard. And I was like, no, the issue is not, the point is not about it being too hard. The point is that everybody is unclear about methodology. You talk to professors and they'll use this word methodology, and you'll find that people are being inconsistent in the way they use it. That's all negative. I don't want to focus on the inconsistencies. That's not the point. The point is that what I wrote here was from the point of view of student, and that's what I want to do right now. Focus on you, the student, and help you answer this question: what is your methodology? Okay, so let's just imagine you're starting your MTH thesis, perhaps even your PhD dissertation, and your examiner asks you, or your mentor asks you, so what is your methodology? Now, what does he or she mean by that? So in this book, in chapter 8, I deal with what is methodology. Okay, so that's what this is here. Chapter 8, what is methodology? And I've already done the first part of this video where I've talked about the difference between method and methodology. And for now, let's just assume they're the same thing. They have nuances, but for now, let's not get confused between the difference between methodology and method. That's not the point that we're trying to say over here. But what I want to say is that if somebody asks you what is your methodology, they could be asking you three different things. And that's where it gets confusing. The first thing is, they could be asking you, how did you get your data? How are you going to get your data? How are you going to find your books? How are you going to get your resources? That's your methodology. Basically, you don't know something, but you have to find out something. How are you going to find out? That find out, that discovery process is methodology. Now, this understanding of methodology is quite common in empirical studies. Empirical, as you know, is like the interviews or questionnaires. So for that, defining how you get your data is very important. And so when they say research methodology, they literally mean research, means going to the field. How are you getting your information from the field? But sometimes even non-empirical research uses this understanding of methodology, and I've mentioned them in this book. Now, let's not get into too much technicality in the book, because I say there are three different kinds of ways you can get information. So one is when somebody is saying how you get your information, they could be meaning what are your presuppositions, what is guiding your research process. So you could be, let's say, an ecumenical scholar. So does that mean you'll be biased towards ecumenical thinking? Or you could be a Catholic researcher, or you could be a Pentecostal researcher, or you could even be an evangelical researcher. How will these presuppositions guide your thinking? Will you only confirm your bias? Will you look at other perspectives? How will you prevent yourself from imposing your view? Sometimes it's okay to let your presuppositions guide you, but the examiner will expect you to be explicit. This is my methodology. This is how I gathered my data. So that's just one example of methodology as a research process. There's also mapping when it comes to, like what are the words, what are the concepts that are governing your thinking. So when I did my dissertation on what is religion, I had to have a starting understanding of what is religion before even I could define it. So I would have to say, okay, this is how religion is generally understood. And then from there, I go to provide another definition of religion or an alternative definition of religion. So that mapping means finding out what are the various views, what are the various options out there. And that's the field, what is happening. And that mapping process guides me in how I'm going to proceed. So that's mapping over there. And then I also have research methods instead of methodology. Some people actually say only focus on getting the information, how you gather the data, evaluate the data. But evaluation will come later. But how are you gathering the data? And that's also how they think about methodology. Now, I've just listed these three here. For those who want to understand that more, you can read that. This is from pages 61 to 63. I don't want to get into too much detail, but if you can just broadly understand how you gather your information. That's the first understanding of methodology. Okay, and there are many nuances to this, but for now, how do you gather your information first time? The second understanding of methodology, if somebody was to say, what's your methodology? They could be meaning this, and that is methodology as, according to my book, I've said, as an engagement framework, which means how are you going to engage with your data? How are you going to analyze your data? How are you going to evaluate your data? Now that is, especially in the theology department, very critical. When we mean methodology, we usually mean this. What is the basis you're using to prefer one scholar's view over the other? What makes something right? What makes something wrong? Why do you prefer something? Why do you not prefer something? Which work are you going to look at in more detail? So this is the engagement framework. On what basis am I going to evaluate? There are four different ways of understanding engagement framework. And we again don't need to get into this in too much detail, but one is very simply, if you're a biblical studies student, you would probably understand this most clearly. What is your interpretative framework? That means, are you taking the narrative approach? Are you taking the rhetorical approach, socio-critical approach, historical approach? So these are ways I'm going to interpret the text, right? So that's the first, that's one kind of way to engage with data. Another kind especially useful in theology and philosophy is your ideological framework, which means, am I using a feminist approach? Am I using a Dalit approach, an environmental approach, a postmodern approach? So that is the basis I use to engage with something. The other way of engaging with data is to take the model approach. Here I say model means I take one scholar's view and make that scholar's view normative. And I say, from this scholar's view, I'm going to analyze other scholars. So this scholar becomes my starting point. And from that, I look at others. So I could be looking at a theologian called Karl Barth, and from Barth, I analyze other views. So a Barthian approach, something like that. Or like I could even take one social critic like Amartya Sen. So Amartya Sen's approach being applied to social work. So taking one model and using that as my framework. So that is the second kind of methodology. What is your methodology meaning? How do you engage with data? Now there are many options with that, where I've showed a few. It's just for you to try to understand what that means. Okay, so that's the second one. So first one was, what is the first one? How do you gather your data? Second one is, how do you analyze your data? How do you engage with your data? The third understanding of methodology, and this is, so when somebody says, what is your methodology? They could be meaning this. And this is methodology as your writing plan, which means how are you going to write your paper? How are you going to write your dissertation? Now, this is not that common because sometimes they don't use the word methodology, but they expect this to be part of your methodology. They expect you to be clear how you're writing your paper in your methodology section. So over here, I've again applied, I've shown different ways to understand how we look at methodology as a writing methodology. So one is methodology as a theory. So this is where you may have heard a background theory, a focal theory, data theory. So this is where a focal theory directs the writing of my work. Okay, so that's explained over here, that a certain perspective, certain thinking, a certain theory influences the writing, how I lay out my work. I first argue this, then I argue this, then I argue this. Another way methodology as a writing plan is by using certain aspects of critical thinking. Now I've seen this like in a university, in Mysore University, they said, what is your methodology? And what by that they meant, are you using the analytical framework, comparative framework, critical framework, constructive framework? So they meant that. So very clearly something to do with the writing. What are you doing in your work? Are you critiquing? Are you evaluating? Are you constructing? So being clear about your methodology means be clear about your writing. And another kind of methodology as a writing structure very simply means your writing plan. What is going to be in your chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. So here they might expect you to be clear about what is your research question, or what is your primary question, and what are your secondary questions, and how do your chapters relate to your secondary questions and your primary question. Now that is also methodology, but seen very narrowly as the method of your paper, the writing structure of your paper. Like I said, not many people will call that methodology, but some people do. Some people have done it. I've seen people do it, and I've also quoted people who use this understanding of methodology and expect their students to be clear about that. So just to recap, basically what I'm saying is, when somebody asks you what is your methodology, they could be asking you three things. One is, how did you gather your data? The other one is, how did you evaluate or engage with your data? And the third is, what is your writing plan? Now, I'm not saying this is what you should do, but knowing this information, if somebody asks you what is your methodology, you can use this information to clarify. Excuse me, sir, excuse me, ma'am, what do you mean by this? Do you mean this? Do you mean my evaluative framework? Do you mean my writing plan? Or do you mean all three? And sometimes a teacher may actually expect all three, but at least it will help you to systematically think about what is being expected in your dissertation or in your paper. Okay, so I hope it's helpful. I didn't give too much detail. That is basically there in the work. So I gave you an overview of what is there in the methodology chapter. Now, there is one more section in the methodology chapter where I say how I would recommend we address methodology. Now, this is, sorry, I lost my page. And this is, it was basically when I was in the theology department. How did we expect methodology to be written out? Even in the MTH and in the PhD sections. So I gave an example of that in this work. Now, I don't know whether this is helpful for you, because I'm not even sure whether my previous college is even using this anymore. Maybe they find this too difficult. Maybe this is too intense. But definitely for PhD students, I would strongly recommend you to go through this third section, stating your methodology in a dissertation. How would you state it? How would you put it in your proposal? How would you put it in your thesis? And here I give certain guidelines, like it would have this section, it would have that section. This is how you would address the three questions. How do you gather your data, evaluate your data, and present your data? How would you do that? I don't think I'll make a video about it. That's there in the book for you to read if you want, because that's just an example. That's just something being offered to you. But for now, I hope that you found this helpful. And if this video comes out okay, I might be doing more videos because I can do it in the night where it's quieter and I have a little bit more time. Okay, so till the next time, bye-bye.